Welcome to this recording from the Various Urban Politics Seminar Series. In the following, you hear Elisabetta Gobbo from Erasmus University Rotterdam talking about housing allocation, clustering and spatial justice, followed by a discussion. The recording is of 13th November 2024. Two further talks from the same afternoon by Josh Ryan Collins, UCL London, and Sarah Özegül and myself, Christian Lamker from the University of Groningen, are available separately.
Thank you everyone. Thanks for inviting me today. So it's a completely different from the one that we just had. So I do political philosophy, and what I'm trying to do in my PhD project is to contribute to the literature on spatial justice from political philosophy. Now, especially I'm taking a liberal relational egalitarian perspective, which very briefly is a perspective in political philosophy that takes into account basic liberties and rights, that focuses on inequalities in opportunities, so resources and services, for instance, but also inequalities in the status, so where one is positioned within society. Now, I'm not going to go into detail with this view, but maybe it's a good thing to keep in the background. Now, political philosophers have entered the debate on spatial justice relatively recently, relatively in big letters, because there is a lot being done on it. But so when I started my PhD, I started with urban scholars, mostly. And what I noticed is that in urban scholar papers and books, but also in more empirical research, there is a wide and varied use of the term spatial justice and spatial inequality, with no very precise definition. So what I try to do in this paper is to focus on that concept, spatial justice. I start from a conceptualization that comes from urban studies, and then I connect it to a problem in political philosophy and try to offer a solution to it. So exactly, I try to find a bridge between urban studies and political philosophy, identify a common problem that I think they both have when talking about spatial justice, and I try to propose a solution that makes sense of the philosophical debates, that draws clearer normative reflections on what spatial justice entails, and that possibly informs some policy criticism and appraisal. Right. So to start, let's find this common problem. So the common problem comes from, or the way that I see it comes from this type of discourse. So in this paper, Automark and other authors, but they talk about what spatial inequality is, and they try to identify two main aspects of it. So we have segregation and marginalization. Now, segregation is taken to be a residential pattern, so how people cluster in space, more than the normatively laden notion of segregation that we have from the segregated US debates. So my problem with their idea of spatial inequality is that the relation between segregation and marginalization is not always clear. So it's not clear whether segregation and marginalization necessarily come together, whether we can separate them, whether they are independently wrong, or whether they become a problem only when they come at the same time. So to give you an example, in their paper, they say that disadvantaged groups are indeed segregated as they are relegated to areas with substandard provisions. Now, the first part of the sentence tells us that people live in different areas of the city, but segregation, by this definition, also entails that those areas have inequalities in the characteristics. Now, the second part of the sentence is also their definition of marginalization. So it becomes unclear whether if segregation indeed is problematic only insofar as it's coupled with marginalization, or if there are objections to segregation that run independently of marginalization. And if this distinction is not really there, then why separate the two concepts? Right. And I think this type of problem also runs in the political philosophy debates on residential patterns, so clustering and inequality in the city. So political philosophers as well, I think, are unable to differentiate between problems that only concern clustered residential patterns and problems that concern clustered residential patterns with inequalities in status and opportunities. Right, so this looks a bit messy, I think, in the debate. So segregation and marginalization seem to be very, confused in a way, and I would like to have more clear conceptual tools to analyze the problem. So this is what I'm looking for, basically. So basically what I will do now is to try to disentangle these two topics, segregation and marginalization, and see how they relate to each other. And then I will show how this is relevant for the political philosophy debates. So let's start with segregation. So what I'm trying to take, one thing that I want to clarify is that I want to take a minimal definition of segregation and not a normatively packed concept. And what I mean by this is that I want to have a definition of segregation that does not necessarily entail independently unjust elements. So what I don't want to have is a definition of segregation in this that it implies other clearly wrong things. So for example, but one thing that is important to notice is that my arguments do not entail that some types of segregations that are clearly wrong are not. So racial segregation in the US or the segregation of the Jewish community during the Shoah are problematic according to my accounts, and my definition of segregation does not entail that they are not. But they clearly have an independently unjust element to them, which is racism, discrimination, the violation of equal moral status, and so on and so forth. Right, so this minimal definition that I want to take has two necessary and sufficient conditions. So there must be a group of individuals that is identifiable along some characteristic X, such that the agents in the group with characteristic X cluster in some space Y. So segregation is focused on where people live, but not on the characteristic of the place where people live. So again, we're looking at residential patterns. Now, this minimal definition is perfectly in line with the use of the term segregation in empirical studies. So it's in line with standard measures of segregation, like the dissimilarity index. Similarity index measures the degree to which two or more groups live separately from one another in different parts of the urban environments. For instance, now, of course, most studies don't use just the dissimilarity index. They use a conglomeration of different indexes to measure segregation. But indeed, they use this term with a minimal definition so that it does not, again, entail a necessarily independent ground. Right. So examples of segregation under this minimal definition are like this. Unequal but segregated city, because citizens are spatially divided based on income. Low to middle income households live in area L and M, and high income citizens inhabit area H. Areas L, M, and H are perfectly equal in terms of public and private services, like schools, cafes, cinema, hospitals, etc. And even if the quality of the locations in which residents live is the same, equal but segregated cities is a segregated city based on income. Right. So now let's move to the second aspect, which is marginalization. Now, for marginalization to obtain, I contend there are three necessary and sufficient conditions. There is an agent that can be identified along some characteristic, and all things equal, she is put in a position of disadvantage in terms of opportunities or treated with disrespect compared to other people who do not have X. Now, this is a general definition of marginalization, but what I would like to get in this paper is a specific spatial connotation to it. So to make marginalization spatial, I add a third condition. So her disadvantaged position obtains through the following spatially laden mechanisms. She dwells in spaces that give her less opportunities compared to the spaces available to those who do not have X. And the processes via which access to spaces is managed, or the ways in which the spaces in which she dwells are treated, signal disrespect towards her. Right. So marginalization has more to do with the inequality of opportunity that comes with the type of spaces that you dwell in, the type of treatment that the government reserves to those spaces where people with a certain characteristic dwells, and the type of mechanisms that we have for determining who accesses which type of space. Right, so once we have these three definitions, I think we have examples that can help us disentangle the concepts. So we can have marginalization without segregation. I think women in academic philosophy are an example. Women are a minority in philosophy departments generally, but they're not denied access to them because they are identified as women. Nonetheless, once they're hired because of being identified as women, they tend to be in a position of disadvantage. They tend not to be taken seriously in their research. They are asked to do secretary and administrative work more often than their male colleagues. They are invited to meetings, but whenever they fall, they're shushed. So women in academic philosophy are a marginalized group, even though they're not segregated. Another example that helps disentangling is unequal and segregated city. So in unequal and segregated cities, it's like the example before, but now the areas are unequal. So it's a condition in which we have both marginalization and segregation. And then we have a situation in which we have spatial marginalization without segregation, which is bad housing in luxury lands. So in neighborhood luxury land, there are amazing villas, great apartments, and more poorly insulated ones. Lower income households can only afford to live in the latter. And even though they're not segregated, because indeed they live in the same neighborhood as the rich people, they are spatially marginalized because of the type of spaces that they get access to within those neighborhoods. So from these examples, which are very, I don't know, maybe up in the air, but from these examples, we end up with these relations. There can be segregation without marginalization. The example is equal but segregated city. We can have marginalization without segregation, like women in academic philosophy. And we can have spatial marginalization without segregation, which is bad housing in luxury lands. So from these examples and the definitions that I offer, it seems that segregation and marginalization are indifferent to each other. One does not necessarily entail the other. So this implies that when we do analyze conditions of segregation and marginalization, again, minimal definition of segregation, we have to be aware that they are two separate problems, at least conceptually. Right, so what I suggest is that ultimately spatial marginalization is what matters and not per se the residential pattern that people live in. So another way to put it is that segregation is not per se, intrinsically per se, inimical to liberal relational egalitarianism. So residential patterns per se do not matter if we consider a theory that values basic rights and liberties, such as the freedom of movement and association of people, that considers inequalities in opportunities, like distributive inequalities, but also relational inequalities, so relations of inferiority with others. Seems like a pretty exhaustive theory. And according to it, it seems that segregation per se is not problematic. So I think this also tracks some examples of segregated spaces that we don't think are problematic, like exclusive holiday resorts, right? So there are some resorts that only extremely rich people can afford to go to for their holidays. They are extremely segregated places. We also have examples of clubs. Clubs are extremely segregated places, but we also have segregated places that we usually justify. So for instance, we allow some religious community to live in highly clustered areas because that's necessary for them to go on with their religious beliefs and have a fulfilling life according to their own view of the good lives, etc., etc., etc. Another example is the artisthood. Now imagine that artists are poor. Young artists cluster together in a neighborhood. The neighborhood is called Musicalia. They love to share their art and find inspiration from being in close proximity with each other. Musicalia is a segregated neighborhood, but it seems that from a relational egalitarian perspective, we have no reasons to oppose to it, even if artists are all poor. That's the point. But does it mean that segregation is always fine? No. And I think this is an important point, but we have to find when segregation is fine or not fine. And I think that the normative work in answering to this question is done by marginalization. So we have at least marginalization-dependent reasons to oppose segregation. Thus, if segregation marginalizes, we have reasons to be concerned with it. And these reasons have to do with the modality, so how the segregation comes about. Again, in the example of racial segregation in the US, you know that the way in which segregation was imposed because of the beliefs that the system upheld, and the way in which it happened, it was clearly wrong, but they also have to do with the quality. So if we end up having segregated communities that live in unequally put neighborhoods that hamper their equality of opportunity and relational equalities, then segregation is problematic. Right, so I think this distinction between segregation and marginalization and the focus on spatial marginalization as the wrongdoing in the debate helps us understand the debates in integrationist policies in political philosophy. So on one side, we have Elisabetta Anderson, who published the book Imperative of Integration in 2008. In the book was highly criticized by many people, including, not young, of course, like Shelby, Marcuse has positions that go against Anderson, and Sandstrom, amongst others. Now, how to understand what the disagreement is actually about? And I think we should understand the disagreements in terms of marginalization. Okay, I don't know. Yes, I have time. 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, fantastic. So, so Elisabetta Anderson contends that we have an imperative to integrate as societies. Of course, the context here is racially divided United States of America. So she contends that because of previous segregation, we still have a segregated society in the US, and we have an imperative to integrate. Now, integration has many facets in Anderson's view. Now, what I'm focusing specifically is integration in terms of residential mixing, which she wants to favor. And most of the arguments specifically about residential mixing rely on the idea of cultural disadvantage. So what Anderson says is that because there is high segregation of Black Americans in the ghettos, and the most cultural value is in the highly segregated white neighborhoods, we should mix, because there are some loops of cultural development that do not get developed if we don't mix these two sets of people. She emphasizes the imperative to integrate, also this residential factor, instead of the imperative to demarginalize independently of where people live. So a consequence of focusing on segregation and not marginalization is that, for instance, she pays very little attention to what the consequences of integration will be for the ghettos themselves. And for the culture in the ghetto and the value that is there. Ghetto is a proxy for highly segregated Black US neighborhoods in the debate. Right, so she contends that residential patterns are normatively valuable, so the level of mixing in society in the residential checkerboard is valuable. It's important to have this mixing because of cultural capital, which is hoarded in the white communities. And I think, that's a very controversial argument. And she also completely disregards economic association on many levels, even though she doesn't want to, but I think her arguments lead to that. Right. So my contention is that we can understand this position and the disagreements towards this position in terms of the fact that she fails to decouple segregation in the minimal definition and marginalization, whilst Marcuse, Young, Shelby, and Sandstrom all focus squarely on the conditions that make segregation wrong, namely what I call spatial marginalization. Now, this is also something that activists suggest. Now, we don't have to, this is just an example, there are many of them, but Malcolm X, this is a speech, so they don't call Chinatown in New York City or on the West Coast a segregated community, yet it's all Chinese. But the Chinese control it, Chinese voluntarily live there, they control it, they run it. They have their own schools, they control their own politics, control their own industry, and they don't feel like they're being made inferior because they have to live by themselves. They choose to live to themselves, they live there voluntarily, and they're doing for themselves in their community the same thing you do for yourself in your community. Now, again, like not going into the details, what this type of discourse tells us is that residential mixing might not even be that desirable from the segregated community themselves. What people actually care about is not to live in marginalized conditions. Now, in this speech, for instance, we have a lot of focus on voluntary movements. So one opposition to my proposal would be this. So isn't it just a matter of voluntariness after all? Can we just simplify all of this by saying that people should be free to live where they want to live? So we could say that when segregation is voluntary, it is a choice of the segregated individuals, then it's not problematic. I think this is a bad reconstruction, or like a bad attempt to find what is bad about segregation. Why? Well, because we have, like with this definition, we could have highly segregated, extremely rich communities that hoard opportunities. And yeah, it seems that we don't want to have that. Or like, think about gated communities, right? In most of the metropolitan areas in South America, for instance. So an amendment to this would be, well, when segregation is voluntary, it is a choice of the segregated individuals, and it is non-exclusive, meaning that we cannot block entry in these communities, then it's not problematic. And I think, once again, this is not a good attempt to determine when segregation is bad, because voluntariness is an unsatisfactory criterion for a few reasons. So the degree to which one can voluntarily choose where to reside is constantly bound by structural and uncontrollable factors, such as the ability, independent or price, of residential space in the city. And there are cases of involuntary segregation that seem unproblematic, and cases of voluntary segregation that seem problematic. So again, the second part would be the rich segregated community with a gate around it that impedes entry from the others. And an example of involuntary segregation that seems unproblematic is, for instance, what happens when a city is fully, like the only places that we have available to live in a city are in a certain neighborhood, because maybe there's a new neighborhood being built in that city. So it can be that, for instance, immigrants are all incentivized to go in that neighborhood because it's a free one, because it's maybe social housing, so we have a high concentration, involuntary, because these people couldn't really choose where to live. But depending on the quality of the buildings and the quality of the neighborhood, this might be. Okay, so I'm going to skip all of this, but what I want to say is that this type of position can also be useful in criticizing desegregation policies. This is African births in Rotterdam, so we can say that these policies are problematic, not just because they're inefficient most of the times, but because they target a non-problem, which is the mixing problem. They should be focusing on marginalization of the groups that they target to integrate. Right. I think I am. This is the summary.
So much. So what I really like here is that you are going through work that's been done at Urban Studies and then kind of conceptually cleaning it up, as it were. Yeah, and reconstructing arguments there, which I think is extremely valuable work. Yeah. Thanks, Elisabetta. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Who would like to?
Yeah, I really like your struggle to disentangle this whole mess of arguments that's floating around. But I'm wondering, I mean, you try to separate, at the one hand, marginalization from segregation, and I see the value of that. But still, at the same time, empirically, they're closely related, right? I mean, we see that depending on who is living in a certain space, the space has a different shape, has different amenities, because they have a certain market power at this location. So we have different shops, for example. They have a different political color, so the local government invests in this place for that local networks. So they're intrinsically linked. So what do you do with this in your theory? That's mainly what I'm trying to grasp, because when I'm thinking about spatial justice myself, to set it apart from social justice, I'm always looking for spatial mechanisms that are intrinsically spatial or that are related to a certain location in some way, maybe because of clustering, maybe because there is a distributional effect either through the state, through the market, or through the family. So how do you integrate it into your theory?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think my thought on that is, well, if we were to establish that the only way to make sure that all, let's say in a checkerboard, all of the squares have decent, good amenities and opportunities. If you were to establish that the only way to do that is to have residential mixing, then I would be on board with that. But I think that comes with extreme costs in a way. So for instance, it doesn't challenge the mechanisms via which we end up having type of inequalities. So for instance, we could say, well, if we do find out that the locations in which most of the second generation migrants live in the Netherlands are the ones that are least prone to have public investments in them, or have less transportation in them, or have less job opportunities in them, then we might question why that is the case. So instead of thinking of, oh, okay, that is bad, we should move people, we should look at, are the mechanisms that make it so that there is a concentration of disadvantage here just? And if most likely they're not. So maybe we should work on those. I think I'm just trying to shift the focus from a medical model of fixing the problem to a more restructuring model.
Yeah, that would be an appealing story as well to local politicians, right? Because you provide them two price tags, either a price tag of mixing with certain benefits, or by solving it, that's kind of a prevention strategy, or to have a more curative strategy to solve it.
And I think maybe also like an important part that a nice thing about this type of discourse is that it doesn't prevent forward-looking mixing. So for instance, I think that this type of argument would favor diversification of housing offer per neighborhoods, not on the basis of the fact that mixing is good for some social cultural things per se, but because it enhances freedom of movement and freedom of choice of individuals who can then decide to cluster or not to cluster according to their own wishes and needs. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Next question. Yes.
Yes. A very brief question. As a geographer, interesting questions of place, which comes clearly out, but also often a question of scale, which maybe I'll start looking a little bit for, especially where you had, I think, one of the stories where you had different types of houses within the same neighborhood. I remember reading a paper during my bachelor where you were analyzing the same cities, and then depending whether you looked at block level, neighborhood level, district level, the city would come out as segregated or not segregated.
Yeah.
So how is there a place for scale in the model?
Yeah. So I think, so for instance, the dissimilarity index, in my knowledge, is prone to having that problem. Well, the dissimilarity index should have that problem, right? So it is not able to look at smaller scales than the metropolitan area, if I'm correct. So what people do is that they mix together different indexes. But yeah, so I think from a more abstract perspective, this type of discourse does not need to be specific on just the city, could also be the region level. But yeah, it's something that I keep I think it's an important question that I don't know yet how to answer, because you can go even smaller scale. So if you look at a residential building itself, you can have somehow
Well, that's one of there's been some debates at we probably got the age-long debate between social mix and whether different social groups interact, and how that might affect well-being. And you say, well, if you mix it level in an apartment level, like the floor, then it might not have beneficial effects. But if you do it on like 3 floors or 3 blocks, there's a whole scalar sensitivity, which is there's probably not a single. It's almost by a case basis.
I think they also did a study, I think it was specifically in Rotterdam, with social mixing and the perception of inclusivity in society. And I think they found that third generation migrants felt less included in more mixed neighborhoods than second generation migrants, and second generation migrants less than first generation migrants. But they were wondering whether in the end, enforcing mixing was actually making people feel less included. So there's all sorts of interesting.
Next question. I had a question about your minimal segregation notion, which you, if I understood you correctly, you strip away any harm that is associated with just segregation. So you're just in a spatially segregated community, and you want to have a definition which says there's essentially nothing wrong with that unless it's connected to other harms which are independently caused.
No, I think it's different. So I don't want to plug into the definition something that is already necessarily wrong.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if this segregates, just being segregated itself, if that just doesn't come with harms to some degree, such as less opportunity to be exposed to different groups, for instance.
Yeah.
Which I guess was sort of what Anderson was trying to argue at some degree, at some way.
Yeah. So I think
that being segregated is in and of itself problematic.
Yeah. So I think here are the So if you talk about residential mixing, of course we're not talking about having segregated institutions or that the summer school that you go to is a segregated summer school. We're talking about strictly residential patterns. But I think the problem with the Anderson so I don't see why it would be necessary for people to live in mixed neighborhood by to have that type of feeling of being exposed to other cultures. But I from a liberal egalitarian perspective, I don't know if it's a request that we can legitimately make on the population.
I'm just thinking about, so if you would indeed, so what you suggest to me, what your whole point is that we separate out marginalization and segregation. And if we have highly segregated communities, which are nevertheless not at all marginalized, which are privileged communities, but there could still be aspects of that which we would want to say is undermining, I'm not sure if it would fit into the national egalitarianism framework, but would be undermining, justice, just along other lines, as it were. That there's just something problematic about this very cocooned living, as it were.
Yeah. So for you can say many things about it. So you could say that living in a cocoon way diminishes the values of multiculturality and the values of attachment to the nation instead of just your own community or your capacity to understand the
others' perspectives. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm not opposed to that. I think it could, it can be the case that this is true. I think it's the studies that have been done to show that segregation causes these harms have been done on societies that are not only segregated, but they are segregated and marginalized.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we all had equals and segregated, which is not what I'm arguing that we should have, but imagine that we have that, those studies don't apply. Because they always look at marginalized in relation to privilege.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's sort of like what the multicultural society project was in the Netherlands, I think. It's, separate people. Yeah.
Just a short comment on it. It can also be that the segregation creates different circumstances and not necessarily worse. Like the example of the school life or the artists together, they have some benefits and some disadvantages compared to integrated or mixed living, so that you can't really say really marginalized, but it has its benefits and disadvantages. So that it just creates a different environment.
Yeah, but I think so. Something that I would love to clarify is that I'm not arguing for the fact that we should live in these cocoon areas. It's not that I'm arguing that we shouldn't be exposed to other cultures.
I understand.
I just think that these type of arguments don't lead us the right way.
And I think that just even clearing up those conceptual distinctions is very, very valuable as a debate.
So thank you very much. Very stimulating, and there's lots of thought in this. I was just wondering, is your ambition to you create a sort of theory of marginalizations? But is that a static? Are you trying to develop a static view or a dynamic view? Because segregation or both segregation and marginalization lead to disadvantages or advantages, right? So that it's not so you in all your examples you give us a snapshot picture of a situation, then you say this might not be this or that, but the key thing is that it changes things over time to be segregated or to be marginalized, right? If you live in a certain neighborhood, people ask for your postcode or ask for the street you live, and they will treat you differently. And so it becomes, for instance, self-reinforcing. You get that sort of dynamics. Is that part of your framework? Or?
I think so. It's something that I was thinking about in terms of marginalization, right? So if you live in a marginalized neighborhoods and you have kids, like it just spills over, and it's a self-reinforcing mechanism, right? So that for sure, I think. So this type of account acknowledges that, and it's actually based on these self-reinforcing mechanisms that happen over time. But so I don't know if segregation does that. It for sure does when it's coupled with marginalization, but I'm unsure that it does if it's not coupled with marginalization.
But even groups that are not marginalized, such as Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, right?
Yeah.
They may be very wealthy people and they choose to live there together, etc., etc. But the very fact that they live there together may create disadvantages for them. Is that a form of marginalization that develops because of the segregation dynamically over time? Because those are questions. Are those questions part of your research project here? Maybe that's the first. You could also say, okay, this is just beyond what I'm looking at. I don't know.
No, so I think that's interesting. I never thought about the Jewish community. That could be marginalized over time. But so I think I hadn't thought about it in terms of segregation, but I think still it makes sense. So if segregation ends up, or maybe it's a bit more in line with what I was saying before. So if segregation ends up creating marginalization, we have good reasons to break it. So if we see that segregated communities, even when they are privileged and justified for, being able to voluntary, like with the good connections, but then we see that throughout time they end up creating marginalization, then we have good reasons to see.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, where the marginalization comes from. So is it segregation because of marginalization, or is there something else that we should change in the loop? But it for sure causes for redress of the marginalization.
Yeah. So that was impacts on what your interventions would be. Yeah. But I can see what you're also arguing is that the downstream problems that might result in marginalization might be external factors, which it's not the segregation itself, but external factors in society. We should move on because we are after 4:00. Any remaining questions we can come back to in the discussion at the end. Thank you so much, Elisabetta.
Various Urban Politics is a hybrid seminar series hosted by the University of Groningen, the Netherlands. The series is organized by Marian Counihan, University College Groningen, and myself, Christian Lamker, from the Faculty of Spatial Sciences, with input from Elen Trell, Marlieke Wilders, and Ryan Wittingslow. We are hosted by the Transitions and Social Justice Working Group at the Rudolf Agricola School for Sustainable Development and funded by the Young Academy Groningen SER Interdisciplinary Projects Incentive Fund.